It doesn't matter if you come from South Africa, Tanzania, Rwanda, or Nigeria. All we know is that Africans have faced mistreatment, discrimination, and oppression at the hands of the Europeans. Every country has multiple accounts of that. But why? What made Europeans target Africa? What did they see in Africa that we don't see? We know that Europeans came to Africa for some reason as collecting valuable minerals that would enrich them. However, is that the case? Europeans viewed Africans as a threat. Some scholars have tried to figure out why this is the case. Why do countries that have much technology and weapons view Africa as a threat? What made Africa so dangerous to them? In today's video, we will take you on a journey as to why Africans were considered dangerous. There is no conclusive answer to this, since many have a theory of a reason why the whites did this. Despite questions that concern the rehabilitation of historians and Greek scholars like Diodorus Siculus and Herodotus, their work highlight a very important narrative that existed during ancient periods. So are Greek scholars reliable in changing the history of Africans? Whether their words about Africa were true or not, they reveal what the common discourse was among the elites, an ancient commentary that influenced later periods. Some of the ancient narratives suggest the consideration of the Africans being the first people in terms of being among the first civilized. Why do they say that? This statement is proof. Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men. And the proof of this statement, they say, it manifests. For they did not come to their lands as immigrants from abroad, but were natives of it, and so justly bear the name of autochthons, is, they maintain, conceived by practically all men. Furthermore, that those who dwell beneath the noonday sun were, in all likelihood, and the first to be generated by the earth, is clear to all, since inasmuch as it was the warmth of the sun, which is the generation of the universe, dried up the earth when it was still wet, and impregnated it with life. It is reasonable to suppose that the region which was nearest to the sun was the first to bring forth living creatures. These were the words said by Diodorus Siculus. Amazingly, we find the Greek scholar came to a similar conclusion that we did concerning the origin of humans, placing them on the African continent. These narratives survived into more modern ages. Constantine Delvolny, one of the most popular figures back in the 18th century, said, "We have the strongest reason to believe that the country neighboring to the tropic, Sudan and southern Egypt, was in the cradles of the sciences, and of consequence, that was the first learned nation, was a nation of black. For it is incontrovertible that by Ethiopians the ancients meant to represent a people of black complexion, thick lips, and woolly hair." Another reason why Africans may have been viewed as threats play on the previous ancient models is because of the narrative event by the writer and modern contemporaries. Fear of genetic annihilation inevitably developed. People in ancient times, and even some of the earliest observers, conclude that humanity's oldest civilization and people were Africans. So is this the reason why Africans were threats? It is important to note that this view was recently challenged. If we start to use this ancient perspective on Africans, we can certainly see the reason why African people came to be viewed as threats because of the implication of being the oldest human people compared to the whites. If Africans are the oldest humans who possibly spread throughout the planet, then humanity can easily go back to its original African mode. Even though this was termed as a threat or thought in a psychological as a one-drop rule, the one-drop rule stated that if anyone had a drop of African blood, then they could have corrupted the non-African blood and therefore be considered black or Negro. This idea was developed to identify African ancestry in whatever color it came in. This identification would lead to oppressing that individual, keeping them in the same lowly state as other black people, so they would not have to compete economically, socially, politically, and especially genetically. This idea of genetic annihilation was not present among all European ethnic groups in Latin America. An example can come from the Spanish and the Portuguese, seemed to have the children with the enslaved women. They claimed that they were creating a new class and ethnicity. These individuals, for the most part, had privileges and access to the goods and services the society could offer. This also seems to be true among the Arabs to a degree. The Arab slave trade was brutal and dehumanizing. They would have children with enslaved African women. Some of these children navigated the world as Arabs because they adopted the identity and the culture of their Arab fathers in full. Some of the Moors reflected this reality of Arabs and African percentage, but again, identifying in full with non-African fathers at the same time. Many Arabs perpetuated the culture of eunuchs among their enslaved Africans, seemingly to rid themselves of that genetic threat. Another threat comes to the African continent holding so many resources, and these resources ultimately translate into wealth. It is no secret that many modern nations want to control wealth and resources that come from Africa, and a lot of Europeans did a pretty good job at it. This was certainly true in ancient and medieval times. Muslim writer al-Fusayr in Ibn Hakel spoke and referred to the Ghana Empire as a land of gold, describing the king of Ghana at the time as the wealthiest sovereign on earth at the time. This was because during his time, he possessed a lot of wealth and reserves of gold that had been extracted since the early times. Not to forget the Mali Empire and their richness. The writer Ibn Hakel also wrote a description of Saijo Massa concerning its trade across the Sahara and Ghana. I saw a bill in Adagas certifying a debt owed to one of them by one of the traders of Adagas, who was himself of the people of Saijo Massa, in the sum of 4,200 dinars. I have never seen or heard anything comparable to this story in the East. I told it in Al-Iraq, in Fars, in Khurasan, and everywhere it was regarded as a novelty. These were the words of Ibn Haqqah. Sheikh Antijob said Africa was so distinguished in the world for its legendary wealth that it led the Arabs to say, against the camel's mangi, use tar, and against poverty, make a trip to Sudan. To the advantage of former kings and his own, this speaks of how Africa was perceived, and this attracted the eyes of the Europeans. Everyone who knew about its wealth wanted a piece of it. The Arabs were very impressed with the wealth of the Ghana Empire. Arabs encouraged it by making a proverb out of it. Mansa Musa visited to Cairo, displaying his vast wealth and power, certainly oohed and awed, but it simply gave more reason to heighten fears of a black planet, if you will, because everyone knew that access to wealth and resources consolidates and increases power, period, and whoever owns it controls it. Africans were deemed as the owners first from the Arab perspective, and later from the European. This was indeed a fatal combustion for Africans, who were seemingly far more interested in other forms of capital rather than world domination. And so history paints why Africans were viewed as threats: the first humans, the present idea of genetic annihilation, and finally, the resources the Africans had. This made Africans a threat to their neighbors at the time that consisted of the Arabs and the Europeans, both of which took action as soon as possible. I believe this is why there was so much pushback against the Pan-African movement and the economic powerhouse like Lack Street and others. This is because if Africans from all over the world came across together and consolidated a unified identity, they can become owners again. Anyways, this is a theory which might or might not happen if it were to happen. According to research by the American Psychological Association, people have a tendency to perceive black men as larger and more threatening than similar-sized white men. So this paints a picture of why Africans are viewed as a threat. Thank you for watching this video. That is all for today's story. What was more surprising about the story? Let us know in the comments section. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel on your way out.